Welcome, everyone. I am Slavin Lee, the library director here at the Missoula Public Library. Welcome to one of our many NEA Big Read programs centered around Jess Walter's novel, The Cold Millions. We've had a lot of great programming in the last few weeks, and we still have a few left. This program has been funded by the National Endowment of the Arts and Arts Midwest. We also received additional funding from the Phyllis and Dennis Washington Foundation, the Foundation of the Missoula Public Library, the Friends of the Missoula Public Library, and NEA, as I mentioned. I really want to thank Chris for being here. We're very excited. Jess Walter isn't here, but he paid a visit to Missoula County and did a couple of events, one here and then one in Sealy Lake. So I'm really grateful for that. And then I also want to thank the library's community engagement team for putting together such incredible programming. I think Celia will mention the closing party that we have coming up. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to Celia. Thanks again for being here.
Hello, there we go. Good evening, everyone. So I'm Celia. I'm the community engagement specialist at the library. And like Slavin, I just want to welcome you all here. So by now, we have actually had a month of awesome programming centered around the Big Read. I hope you've attended some other events. Next week is our closing party. It's Wednesday evening. It's from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And it's actually a brand new episode, a live recording of the podcast Death in the West, which is based out of Missoula. They're recording a brand new episode. Now I have to look at my notes because I forget what it is. They're going to discuss the mysterious murder of Maurice Higgins. And there will be musical support from local artists Travis Yost and Dylan Running Crane. So we would love to invite you all to that. It should be a really good time. This is the last program of our Big Read, and then next week is the party. So please do join us for that. So if you've read The Cold Millions, you know that there are many themes in that book to kind of sink your teeth into. There's brotherhood, women's suffrage, the right for free speech, labor, income inequality, like really meaty stuff, right? But one of the themes that really stuck out to me personally when I was reading this book was the idea of displacement, especially as it pertains to the itinerant labor workforce and in particular the experience of the indigenous peoples of the West at that time, which is embodied in the book by the character of Jules, who is a member of the Spokane tribe. And Jules had a particular quote that stuck out to me, which I'm going to slightly paraphrase. And the quote is, "But our fish are gone now. The dams keep them away. On the ground, they cleared the hillsides of berries to build more houses. They killed the world and called it progress." So it would be pretty convenient, kind of feel good, right, for us to try and relegate this stuff to this displacement of resources and nature and people to the past, right? But I think we know that that's not exactly the case. It's happening currently. And so it's this like parallel of past and present history that told through the history, or the story rather, of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians that Chris will be talking about tonight. So Chris LaTray is a Métis storyteller and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. His third book, Becoming Little Shell, will be published by Milkweed Editions in 2024. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, won the 2018 Montana Book Award and the 2019 High Plains Book Award. His second book, Descended from a Travel-Worn Satchel, was published in 2021. Chris writes the weekly newsletter, An Irritable Métis, and he is the newly appointed Montana Poet Laureate for 2023 and 2025. So thanks all for being here, and thank you, Chris. And Chris will speak, and then we will have time at the end for a Q&A.
Miigwech, Celia. Already this thing's acting up on me. There we go. Bonjour, Indinoe Maganadug, Ani. That is hello, all of my relatives in Anishinaabe, Owen. All we have is each other, and we are all connected. So when I say we are all related, hello, all of my relatives, I mean that literally. And I want to start with this slide reminding our togetherness, our connectedness, because these are hard things to talk about. Land theft, the parallels of today with the past that we often think of as ancient history, and it is far, far from that. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm probably going to get emotional. I get emotional just hearing somebody else talk about the little shell, because often I feel like I'm the only one, you know? So it's very meaningful to me to have people come out and want to know about my people. Miigwech, chi miigwech, that means thank you very, very much. So now that the tears are over, I'm going to start with the Battle of Whitefish. I am a survivor of the Battle of Whitefish. I'm kind of flippant about that because it was a book reading where I had an essay in a couple issues back of the Whitefish Journal. And I don't remember the title of my essay, but it was about houseless people in Missoula and the parallels between the subject of tonight's conversation, the past and the present. And the reading got off to a really rocky start because we discussed kind of laughingly before this land acknowledgements, which I hate. I'm on record as saying land acknowledgements are the progressive liberals' versions of thoughts and prayers. You say them and with a lot of solemnity at the beginning of something and then proceed to do nothing about it. So I'd rather just not hear it. And this one started out with a land acknowledgement that sounded like it'd been downloaded off the internet like 10 minutes before the event, which is part of the problem with land acknowledgements, is there's not a dedication to making sure you get it right. Though I will say in some recent things I've been to, that seems to be changing a little bit. But and no offense to the host, it's a great lit mag. It was a great event in other ways, but it's offensive to the Native people in the crowd when you can't even get the pronunciations right, the facts are wrong, the dates are wrong, all of those things. So it was off to a bad start anyway. And then what proceeded was a bunch of discussion and kind of flippant humor about how the locals in Whitefish couldn't afford to live there anymore because of all the people from somewhere else moving in and buying all the houses and kind of kicking everybody off the places they'd lived forever. And I just said, welcome to the last 500 fucking years to Native people. I mean, it's the same thing, you know, so that's what we're going to talk about. It's always been about taking, whether it was indigenous people to begin with and now folks on the margins or folks, working class people, the class designations that Jess talks about in the Cold Millions. And if you look at this map, this was just before the little shell got recognized. It's a map of, the reservations in the United States. And if you look on the East Coast, there's essentially nothing. Doesn't mean there weren't Indian people there, right? And even on the West, you see some blue dots, some larger blue spaces. So that is a visual representation of takenness. Not even sharedness, right? It's straight up takenness. This is an example to us who live in this area. We talk about this being Salish land. On the left is what the reservation, all the green land was Salish Kootenai land when the reservation was first established at the Hellgate Treaty of 1855, which we could be there in like 20 minutes if we jumped in a bus right now and headed west out on Mullen Road. It's one of my sacred places, Council Groves. Fast forward past the Dawes Act, which was the allotment era, as we call it. And we look, this is like 1908, 1909. And all the kind of gold color is the allotment. And I don't have time to talk about the details of what allotment was, but it was a land grab in which land was divided up among families so that the federal government believed that owning your own land was part of being a civilized person. But it was really just another way to put someone in a position who had never had to pay taxes on their land before and don't really have a means of income to pay those taxes, and force them to sell it off to white people. So even though the allotment era started out with land being owned by Native people, that quickly changed. And you can see on this map to the right how already the allotment land has impacted so deeply the tribal land. And this is just a slide from a wonderful book, The Politics of Allotment, the Flathead Indian Reservation as a test case. The Flathead, the whole interaction between the government and the Salish and Kootenai people is just a, if you studied one, I say this all the time, if you studied one interaction between the government and Native people, that was one you could study, because it has everything. It has lies, it has forgery, it has theft, it has double dealing, it has everything. And it happens, created this, reverberation today over the last 200 years, 175 years, whatever, still plays out every day. And, Teddy Roosevelt, that last quote, a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. Roosevelt was no friend to Indian people. And it's one of those things that irritates me, because white conservationists hold Roosevelt up to such a high standard, and he was no friend to the people who lived here first. I was in a meeting, I was invited to meet with the folks from Yellowstone National Park about re-indigenizing Yellowstone Park. And the first thing I said to Park Superintendent Cam Shawley is, if you want to be serious about this, rename the Roosevelt Arch. Because he spent like 10 minutes in Yellowstone, and he has an arch named after him. Cam said he'd work on it. So then, like an early version of Big Sky Journal, Big Sky Journal's just real estate porn for out-of-state people, isn't it? I mean, it used to be almost a lit magazine. Now it's just real estate porn. Whoops. I don't know what I'm doing here. This whole thing is booby-trapped. Thanks, Celia. So this was a pamphlet that came out in 1909, I think, 1908. Uncle Sam will give you a home in the Flathead Indian Reservation. Post-Homestead Act, they opened it up. And this is the first page of it. It's literally like a marketing campaign to get people to come and homestead on the Flathead Indian Reservation. And in the wake of that, this is what the map looks like. Remember, the dark green is the tribal-owned land. And if you think about what that land represents, that's the mountains. No one's going to live up on top of McDonald Peak. Grizzly bears are like it up there. But people, that's land theft. Even that big purple spot in the middle, that's the bison range. That was stolen. And then the tribe only just got it back, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago? So a lot of this land was stolen twice. And I bring these as representations just to outline the point that it's been about taking from others from the get-go. Taking from others and giving to the privileged. So there's my guy. Ayabwewi tongue. He who rests on the way. He was the third Little Shell. It wasn't his real name. It was a hereditary title. So Ayabwewi tongue was his actual name. He was the third. There was 100 years of Little Shells, hereditary chiefs of the Pembina Chippewa. We were originally the Pembina Chippewa. And my relative over here asked me on this earlier, how did the Chippewa people end up in Montana? So the Pembina Chippewa were like if you picture to begin with, as Anishinaabe people, we started out on the East Coast more than 1,000 years ago. And our Seven Fires prophecies spoke of all these events that were going to occur, and they have one after the other. And it guided our movement west until we found a place where food grows on the water. Well, what food grows on the water? Wild rice. And wild rice is kind of the signifier of the Ojibwe people, because that was the subsistence food that we lived on. We got to what's Wisconsin now, found food growing on the water, and we knew that's where our prophecy said we were supposed to be. So the Pembina Chippewa are kind of the western and southwestern edge of the Ojibwe people. So if you think of the Great Lakes region, ending, around in Minnesota. Pembina, Chippewa occupy the Red River Valley, which is the border of today's Minnesota and North Dakota, draining up into Hudson's Bay. And we occupied that corner and a little bit to the south in there. So the argument that I make, and I told this story earlier, is people say, well, I thought Ojibwe people were rice eaters. We lived in the Buffalo Plains. We were buffalo hunters. So anytime anybody tries to sell me on wild rice being the food of my people, I tell them it is, at best, the side dish of my people, because it goes pretty well with a nice, big, juicy buffalo steak. But 574, the Little Shell people became the 574th federally recognized tribe in the United States in December of 2019. We haven't existed as the Little Shell tribe until 1978 is when we consolidated as the Little Shell and renamed ourselves after the chief who kind of lost everything. And I'm about to get into that, how that happened. So we had a big celebration in Great Falls in January of 2020, post-federal recognition. And this was a big room in the Holiday Inn, and it was full. There was over 1,000 people there when we expected maybe a couple hundred. So they had video cameras set up opposite that lectern and feeds going into these other rooms so that everybody could see what was going on. And it was a big deal, January 2020. I should say that, what happened 2 months later was COVID, and we didn't meet again until 2022, our powwow. I should also point out that the last time I did a Little Shell presentation in Missoula, it was out at Travelers Rest in March of 2020, and COVID hit like the following week is when everything shut down. So if things go to hell in the next week or so, it's not my fault. The Little Shell tribe, the Pembina Chippewa, were largely comprised of what we know of now as Métis people. Who's ever heard of Métis? That's more than usual. So it's either the word's getting out or you're a bunch of liars. I like to think the word's getting out, because the Métis are a cultural group recognized in Canada but not the United States. We're the same people. So we existed before there was a medicine line, the border between Canada and the United States. The Métis flag was flown before the Canadian flag existed. That's how deeply part of the history of this continent the Métis people are. Métis literally means mixed in French, and you'll see it capital M and you'll see it in a lowercase m. If you see lowercase, we're just talking about the idea of mixed, the word that means mixed. But if you see capital M, Métis, you're talking about a people, a culture, recognized by Canada as one of their 3 indigenous people of their country, being Métis, First Nations, and the Inuit people in Alaska and in the north. Not in Alaska, because that's not Canada. I'm not that dumb. I know my geography. We're a unique cultural group, even though we didn't come into existence until after contact with European people. But the result of that interaction of traders coming into that region and marrying into indigenous families, and the offspring that resulted from that, and the marriages that then unfolded over decades and generations and centuries, created this culture that was a mix of what was happening in Europe and what was happening in the indigenous people of that region. So there was a lot more back and forth than people understand as far as fashion and culture and music. We adopted European fashion because we would trade animal pelts, beaver pelts, whatever we had in the region for things like wool and linen, any of those things that we could get from Europe. Because it's a lot easier to sew clothing out of wool and linen than it is to kill a moose, drag it out of the swamp, skin it, tan it, and then make clothes out of it. So this initial interaction was beneficial to everybody, and everybody thrived as a result of it. We created our own language called Michif. Sometimes the Métis people are also known as the Michif people. Michif is like a trade language, so it's a mix of primarily French and some Gaelic nouns and Ojibwe and Cree verbs. So if you're on the more Ojibwe, Chippewa region, it's going to be a mix of French, Gaelic, and Ojibwe. And if you're a little farther north and a little farther west in the north, it's going to be Cree. And that's because native languages defined the landscape as living. The landscape was alive. The rocks were alive. Languages like French and English go through the world just labeling things. And indigenous languages do not do that. So they're very verb heavy. They're very action oriented. You know, that mix of the local languages, the incoming European languages made Métis people valuable as translators also. So because we spoke so many different languages. Red River carts is a signature of our people. It's considered the documented first use of the wheel by indigenous people on the northern plains was the Red River cart, which was invented is kind of a strong word because obviously the wheel had been around a long time, but this particular configuration that worked so well out on the plains. It was made entirely of wood, so it squeaked like the devil. Every historic reference you hear about the Red River cart, they talk about how loud they were. And they never used grease because grease would gum up and break things, and then they, were non-functional. So they kept it wood so that they had repair materials everywhere they went, so they could repair things on the fly. So they never chose to use grease. Historical references around here, we talk about how it was the French trappers and traders who named Hellgate Canyon here. It was Métis people. Anytime you hear reference to French Canadians, French trappers, French traders, 90% of the time you're talking about Métis people. Because we were the ones out doing the things. The French guys sitting back in his trading post counting his money, he wasn't out doing the stuff. But it was very early on that if you could pass as French and call yourself a French Canadian, you did. If you could pass as white, you did by about 1850 out here, particularly in the late 1860s after the Civil War. And from that point forward, anybody that could pass as white, they did. And that's how we get so many references to French Canadians and French trappers and French traders. Here's an actual photograph from the 1860s in Minnesota of some Métis traders with their Red River cart. So the Red River cart was a big, about 6 foot tall wheel, 2 wheels, with a bed between. And the bed could be taken off so that the conveyance could be floated across a river ford. And they'd carry about 900 pounds. So they would take trade routes anywhere from 10 or 12 to a couple hundred to over 1,000 of these things moving out across the plains, back and forth, up and down, north, south, east, west. Did I skip one? Nope. We were buffalo hunters. I talked about that. This is a painting by Paul Kane from 1846. So he's painting what he actually saw versus a lot of the Western art that we see today, like Charles M. Russell and Frederick Remington. All the stuff that those guys were painting was long past by the time they painted it. So it was no more fantastical than if I were to paint, a bunch of elves fighting a dragon or something, You talk to enough people around here, especially in this generation, you'd think those things were real. Just like the visions that Russell and Remington and those guys painted. So, and then there's some of you who've heard all these jokes already, but I'd like to point out that Charles Russell did more to make the whole world think that all Indians look like extras from Dances with Wolves than just about anybody else. Even though depending on where we're from, we had wildly different appearances. And what I love about this particular painting is if you look closely at the people on horseback, you'll see some guys who look like your traditional Charles M. Russell Indian right next to some dude who looks like he's in a European topcoat or whatever. And that's just how the Métis were. It's just like our families today. We all express ourselves in the way that we want to. So you look at like an old vintage 80s Sears family photo, and mom and dad look basically the same. There might be 2 or 3 kids who kind of look the same. And then there's disgruntled goth kid kind of off to the side. That's how it was for us too. Whatever you had access to, that's how you expressed yourself. We've been expressing ourselves through our clothing and our jewelry and all of those things for as long as we've been people, and we were no different. And we would come out of the Red River, so up where those arrows start, that's what today is Winnipeg, Manitoba, was the Red River colony. And that's where our culture grew out of and went north, went south, and went west. And you see kind of in the middle at the bottom, there's the circle with teepees and the Red River carts around them protecting the village. And then the buffalo herds out into North Dakota. And we would go out all the way to the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains twice a year hunting buffalo. And we would bring back, hides, meat, pemmican. That Métis flag was flown for the first time at what was called the Battle of Seven Oaks in like 1815. What that was two big trading companies, Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, fur trading, fought a small war over exclusive access to Métis pemmican. And what pemmican was, does anybody know what pemmican is? Pemmican's kind of like jerky. So you've got dried meat mixed with fat and some kind of a berry to give it a little sweetness. And what was great about it is it had a high caloric value, so that a lot of people going out and living on the land for a long time wouldn't have to worry about food if you had a bunch of pemmican. It was so important. It was one of the most valued trade goods of the Northern Plains in that period. And we were the principal suppliers of it because we could take those carts out and bring back thousands and thousands of pounds of meat and hides. We were the preeminent buffalo hunting economy on the Northern Plains, and nobody ever talks about it. My friend Rosalind Lapierre, Dr. Rosalind Lapierre, was a consultant on the Ken Burns movie that's coming out about the buffalo. And I didn't know she was a consultant. And I was all indignant from the time I heard about that movie, expecting that we were going to get cut out of the conversation. And she and I were speaking together at the Michif Heritage Keepers Festival in Shodo in this past June. And after she did her talk, I approached her and I said, Rosalind, I feel a lot better knowing that you were a consultant on this movie, because I was prepared to be pissed. And I know that with you there, things are probably going to be okay. And she said, well, you're going to be pissed. She said, just because I was a consultant doesn't mean they listened to what I had to say. So I'm going to have all kinds of opinions about that movie long before I ever actually see it. Here's more art of Métis hunters. Do we have any gamers in here? Like role-playing gamers? Come on. Well, this joke's going to fall flat. Yeah, it's going to fall flat because that dude made a critical fail on whatever dice roll he had to make to stay on his horse, because he's done for. Here's another one. This is called running the buffalo. So Hornaday, who was the taxidermist for what became the Smithsonian Museum, Hornaday comes out in like the late 1886, 1887, because he wants to see the buffalo, and when he gets out here, he realizes they're almost gone. And so he writes this big paper, The Extermination of the American Buffalo, which came out in 1889. And he talks about how these market hunters would get on hilltops and just stay in one spot and kill dozens, if not hundreds of buffalo, one guy at a time, when it's down to like the final 200 animals on the northern herd, and all this is in central Montana. And of course, he kills like 20 of them. His idea is that if he brings back these carcasses and taxidermies them, is that a verb? Okay, it is now. You guys have just been gifted a new word if it didn't exist already. And those animals that he taxidermied are up in Fort Benton at the museum there right now. And he writes about the difference between, what's he call it? The still hunt, which is one person on a hillside or in a train car or whatever, just blasting away, or running the buffalo. And this is running the buffalo when you would get on a horse and with your gun and get out in the middle of them. And he writes in his 1889 Extermination of the American Bison, from all accounts, the Red River half-breeds, who hunted almost exclusively with firearms, never dreamed of the deadly still hunt, but always killed their game by running it. And then he goes on to say how that's like the more pure way to do it because it's dangerous. It would be dangerous. And it's heroic, right? So it's all the kind of manly bullshit that we still deal with all the time. But that's what I call an Easter egg. we show up as the Red River half-breeds. That's where you see us in history. Russell has a painting called Attack on the Red River Carts. And if you don't know what a Red River cart is, you just see what looks like a wagon train off in the corner. But it's Métis people in Red River carts being attacked by Blackfeet. The Métis taught Charles M. Russell everything he knew about cowboying, because that's who the cowboys were in central Montana when he was out there failing as a cowboy. And his statue in Great Falls, he's wearing a Métis sash. If you go to the museum, the Charles M. Russell Museum, his actual Métis sash is there. So those are all Easter eggs showing our presence, but not really talking about it. And I just love all of these old images. People tell me, you know, you don't look like an Indian. I look like these dudes, don't I? I mean, they would gray eventually. More running the buffalo. This is one of my favorite paintings on the planet. It's another Paul Kane one. It's a color version, probably about 1840s again, because that's when he was out among the Red River people, of what a Métis hunting campsite looked like. You've got the carts, the teepees, all the color, you know, the color of the clothing, and you can't really see the beadwork. We were the beaded flower people is what we were known as, because of the intricate beadwork that Rosalind made my head explode last summer, saying those beaded outfits were field guides. So when they would go out on the plains, they would know they were going to look for a certain plant, and maybe they didn't know what it was going to look like during the season that they were going to be there, so they would bead it on their clothing. So while we go around with our Sibleys and our whatevers to try and identify stuff and fail miserably, they just beat it onto their clothes. Isn't that, I mean, it's like, well, of course they did. But it's magnificent, the innovation of how you're going to do that. And I just love this. Even the dogs look like they're having fun. And that looks like a big pizza in the front. It's like, Francois can't shoot for shit, but he makes a good pizza. Let's bring him. Here's an actual photograph. Could be the photograph of the painting that we just looked at. Yeah. What do you think this signifies? What overlooked bit of history about the Métis credit not given? We invented car camping. You just park your vehicle, set your tent up like 5 feet away, spend the night, feel like you had a big adventure, and then you pack it up and just move on to the next spot the next day. So this, marked in red, is what you would call the traditional land at the height of the Pembina Chippewa power, I guess. So it's pretty much all of North Dakota, down into South Dakota, and all the way into eastern Montana. And that line to the east, the red line, that's the course of the Red River. So that's a lot of land that and you have to recognize that traditional land, traditional means something different to indigenous people than it does to our sensibilities, where we like to divide things into states and who's in charge where. It's like right out here, we can say this is Salish land, but you see that photograph that floats around of the Blackfeet camped on the Clark Fork? That was Blackfeet land. If you've got a Blackfeet encampment, it's Blackfeet land. And when they leave, it can go back to being Salish land again. But that's just how it was. People would interact. There would be shared hunting grounds. The Métis fought with the Blackfeet all the time, but we also traded all the time. And we intermarried. Same with the Dakota. Little Shell 1 and 2 were both killed fighting the Dakota. In 1883, the Pembina Chippewa land amounted to that little tiny postage stamp up on the top there called Turtle Mountain Reservation. And that is basically the point where the Pembina Chippewa became the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And we are so closely related as Little Shell to the Turtle Mountain Chippewa that I could disenroll Little Shell today and be enrolled Turtle Mountain Friday. I mean, we are the same people. We're pretty much that related to the Chippewa Cree on Rocky Boy also. Little Shell, whose photograph I showed you, devoted his life to preserving land for his people because he became hereditary chief in the early 1870s. And already there was so much pressure for the tribe to give up land because there was just a flood of settlers coming in and settling on land that had already been agreed to as not being for settlers. They did anyway. So Little Shell, devotes his life to this. And he's not one of those people who is known as well as Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull or any of those big marquee native names. And I contend it's because he doesn't have a body count. He never met Americans on the battlefield. And if in America there's one thing we love is military heroes. His battles were waged in the courts with lawyers and emissaries back and forth between Washington, D.C. Wasn't any less of a struggle. In fact, when Sitting Bull retreated after the Battle of the Little Bighorn across the Medicine Line, he was living with Métis people in this region to the north here. And his presence there created such a level of fear and anxiety that he was going to raise this huge army and sweep south and run all the settlers out. I don't think we give enough credit to just how terrifying the world was in central Montana and western Dakotas and South Dakota at that time, because of the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the fact that this is what happens if the Indians band together. We're kind of screwed. The United States never beat the Indian people on the battlefield. All of the big things that we talk about are massacres of women and children and old people, and starvation. But when they went toe-to-toe, who knew the land better? Indigenous people did. So there was a lot of fear about that. They tried to put us on the Fort Berthold reservation, but Little Shell would not, because they were comprised primarily of people that we fought with more than we traded with. There's even a friend of mine who lived on Fort Berthold told me there's a Little Shell town on the reservation, kind of like there's a Chinatown in San Francisco or whatever. There's a Little Shell town. So I've been through there, but I've never been to Fort Berthold. So the Little Shell were known as the Landless Indians of Montana for over 150 years. And the way that happened is what's called the result of what was called the Macomber Agreement, the 10-cent treaty. And it was a final theft of land from the Pembina Chippewa that began, it was a year before it actually happened. So this guy, Porter Macomber, who's just kind of a bureaucrat, really, he gets the Indian agent from Turtle Mountain to pick 32 tribal members, 16 pureblood Chippewa and 16 Métis, and who will agree to the terms that he's laying out. And when he finds those 32, he says they're all chiefs, and they're not. So a year later, when they have this gathering where Macomber comes out to Turtle Mountain and they're going to work out this agreement, Little Shell goes to say, I'm not going to agree to your 1 cent an acre for this land that we're going to sell you. You have to give me at least $1. And they say, well, sorry, Little Shell, you're actually not a chief. These 32 guys are. So he wasn't allowed to speak, even though he was recognized by the people as a hereditary chief. The feds said he was not. And that's very common in the story of interactions between indigenous people and the federal government, is they would pick the people who would play ball with them, and then that's how they would legitimize their theft of the land. So Little Shell says, to hell with this, I'm not going to participate. And they said, fine, you're not even an Indian. You're not even a person. And no longer are the people who are in your band or are allies with you. It split families. They made a list of the people who would play ball and a list who wouldn't, and they disenrolled everybody who would not. And that is how we became the Landless Indians. And that was in 1892. So it was 100 and whatever years from the Macomber Commission that we wandered. We had no home. We weren't allowed back in Turtle Mountain. We didn't have any land anywhere else in the Dakotas or Montana that had been named ours, because by this point, all of the reservations in Montana already existed. And there's a longer story for why we didn't get negotiated, and if we have time to come back to that, maybe we will, I don't know. But it creates what we call the Métis Archipelago. which, an archipelago is a series of islands, spread out. And our islands became these communities that we either founded, like Lewistown was founded in 1879 by a group of 25 Métis families. And I have a LaTray relative right over there who's also comes from Lewistown. That's where my origins in Montana are, is Lewistown. Mose and Susie LaTray were among the 25 families, and they had like 19 kids. And that led to however many grandkids and however many great-great-grandkids. So when my dad denied that we were related to any of the LaTrays, we're related to every single one. So all of these communities, Lewistown, Anaconda, down the Bitterroot, there were a lot of Métis people down the Bitterroot living among the Salish, even before, the diaspora begins after the Civil War. So like the LaTrays and the Burgers and all the people that created Lewistown, they were out on the Milk River by the early 1860s. And in mass in the late 1860s, and had their homes and communities burned out twice before they moved to Lewistown. So it was I'm coming back to that stressful conflict that's happening in this part of the continent. Great Falls, all along the High Line, there were Métis communities. Shodo, I mentioned the Michif Heritage Keepers Festival in Shodo. It's because there was a Métis community up in the Teton Canyon, 100 people living up there starting in the late 1850s, early 1860s. I grew up in Frenchtown, west of town here. That was also a Red River Métis community, and I grew up with no idea that all the Sears and Lachers and Deschamps and Ducharmes and Lavoies and all of those names are all Métis family names, going way back to like when Chicago and Green Bay were trading posts. So we were all culturally related, and none of us had any idea about it. And why wouldn't we? Because the people who knew, our grandparents and great-grandparents, had made that decision, we're not going to own it because it's straight up dangerous for us to own it. We're talking boarding schools. If they don't know you're Indian, you're not going to get hauled off to a boarding school. Boarding schools touch every indigenous family in the United States, period. Whether it's direct families, family relations, whatever. That horror overlaps into every indigenous family in the United States. And people don't talk about it, though they're starting to now. So all of these places. Deer Lodge. If you go to the Grant Coors Ranch, the very first little display you see is the cover of the late Nicholas Vrooman's book, The Whole Country Was One Robe, and it's a painting of teepees and Red River carts, and it says nothing about the Métis. Johnny Grant was a Red River Métis, the Grant part of Grant Coors. And again, it's stuff that if you don't know, you won't know. But if you know, you see it as an Easter egg. I call them Easter eggs. You see it all the time. And then the last ditch kind of final effort to just get us the hell out of here was called the Cree Deportation Act of 1896. So in 1885 in Canada, there's a big rebellion led by Louis Riel, who was living in Helena before he went back to Canada to lead this rebellion. And he had made a petition to Nelson Miles. Nelson Miles is probably a name familiar to some of you if you have any history at all. He, in 1877, captured Chief Joseph in the Nez Perce. Later, he would go on to capture Geronimo. But he was the guy in charge in the 1870s in central Montana when all this was happening. He thought, so Louis Riel writes a petition for a reservation for the landless Indians, the half-breeds, and Nelson Miles is for it, but it never happens. And that happens throughout the next 100 years. There'd be movements to create reservations and give a space, and then they wouldn't happen. But when the Northwest Rebellion happens in 1885, over the next decade, there's so many people back and forth who have been chased out of their homes in Canada also, because Canada was no better than we are in this time period. So they decided that any Indian who was not on a reservation already was considered a Canadian Indian named Cree, and then rounded up on rail cars and driven on rail cars to Canada and unloaded. And then by the time they shut the door, we would all be running back. So we'd get back to where we started from before the train ever left the station practically. When they ran out of money, they did it on foot. So we hear about the Trail of Tears with the Cherokee all the time. Just about every tribe has a Trail of Tears, and that was ours. This rounding up and essential deportation out of the United States, even though, and I use this line all the time, we didn't cross the border crossed us. We were living here the whole time. We didn't recognize the medicine line. It was nothing to us. When we dedicated the Bear Tracks Bridge about a year ago, there was a photograph that ran in the Missoula, and that was allegedly the picture of the Salish people on their march back across Missoula, the last group in 1891 headed north into the Flathead Reservation. And there were a lot of people who were saying, Salish people saying, well, there wasn't a bridge when they crossed. My grandparents said they crossed on horseback, and that's true. The bridge had washed out. There wasn't a bridge when the Salish. That photograph was from 1896 in the Cree Deportation Act, and if you zoom in on it, you'll see Red River carts. So that was a photograph of our people. Once again, well, who are these? If it's not the Salish, who could it possibly be? Another Easter egg. Not a very nice one, but an Easter egg nonetheless. So that went on and didn't work because, as I said, we would just come back. So a lot of us would find relatives on the other reservations. Were married into every single tribe in Montana, or we would go back to these communities like Great Falls and Lewistown, and we would live on the edges of dumps and scavenge for food and clothes and housing from dumps. We lived next to slaughterhouses, and we subsisted on what we could get from the offal that was on the thrown away from slaughterhouses. Whatever we had to do to survive is what we did. This is a photograph that kind of encapsulates it. This big shot in the top hat with a colonel on the front of his name looking down on these poor Indians. I feel like that photograph has a perfect depiction of who wins and who loses. And that's from Nicholas Ruman's book. So what are the parallels now that we get to the point of this whole thing when it's almost time to stop between all of this? I get rolling and you just open, storm the door if you need to leave. But assimilation. So let's think about assimilation. When the Europeans first came to our land, like in the late 1600s, the only way they could survive was to assimilate with us. So assimilation came from the other side first. They married into our indigenous families because that's how we traded. We would only trade with family. So you would marry into that family. And it was the wives who knew how to forage, who could teach these guys how to survive these long, brutally cold winters. So they assimilated to us first. And over time, as more people came and as the missionaries came, which is a whole nother story, we were Catholics, quasi-Catholics for 50 years before we ever even saw a missionary. So as they gain a foothold, then they start to take advantage of their power, and the indigenous people then get shoved aside and everything taken. Is that what happens here, right? People from us, strangers, other people from other places come here, and they love Missoula. They love Bozeman. They buy their grizz gear, right? They assimilate with our community, and then they move here, and more of them move here, and pretty soon, like those folks in Whitefish, we can't live here anymore because all of these people from somewhere else who love it so much here have made it unlivable for us and totally changed the nature of the culture of the place that they loved to begin with in the first place. So that is a similarity to what happened then to what I believe. And this could all be bullshit. It's just what I think. And I'm the one with the microphone. So feel free to disagree. But it's the same thing playing out over and over again. Getting sold out. So how do we sell out our own communities? Think about those 32 chiefs who, for whatever reason, thought Macomber, what he was offering, was a good thing to do. Now, they were in a period of extreme poverty. There'd been a big famine, a terrible winter, so they were struggling. And so I don't have a lot of animosity for how that played out for the people faced with those hard decisions. But who sells us out in our communities? People say, well, the market says I need to sell my house for 5 times more than anybody can pay for it. You don't have to do that, right? You don't have to sell your house to the highest bidder. We just have been conditioned to do that. And that creates this environment where people like the Pembina Chippewa can't live where they've lived forever anymore because their own community has sold them out. And that happens in the real estate market. Fight me. I strongly believe that's happening. Creates a caste system, right? The people who have rely entirely on the people who have not. So those same people who come in and force everybody away, they still want their baristas. They still want their yoga instructors. They still want their river guides. Yet those people have been cast into a different class, caste, whatever you want to call it, that live almost at the beck and call of the people who have the resources. That was an article that ran in High Country News. I went to Crested Butte, Colorado a few years ago for a writer residency, and during COVID, these rich people are saying they need to show us a little more respect. We're the one who are buying the meals at the restaurants and leaving them tips and all this. And that is a perfect example of that type of a caste system. And the fringe communities. Go anywhere in Missoula and you will see the fringe community, the houseless people. And that essay I wrote for Whitefish Review, that's what it was about. I don't see a bunch of derelicts and drunks and losers when I see houseless people. I see my people. I see the modern version of who my people were and how important it is to me as a Little Shell person to represent the Little Shell in a way that says, I want to be part of something that ensures that nothing like that ever happens again to anyone, because it happened to us. And how can we be part of a system that allows that? So it's the same thing playing out. The victim blaming and lateral violence. You should see the horrific newspaper articles from the day in the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. It's terrible. But so is a lot of the commentary. If you read the comments on any article in the paper about houseless people in Missoula, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. It just happens over and over again because we don't do anything to make it any different. And that includes our non-human relatives. When I say Boozhoo and Ninaway Mugganadog, hello, all my relatives, I'm talking about everybody. The leafed, the hoofed, the beaked, the clawed, the finned. They are all our relatives. And we're doing the same thing to them as we're doing to our human relatives over and over again. And there's cultural stories about all this, because I don't want to end with a downer. Though there's a reason my newsletter is called The Irritable Métis. I think it's pretty apparent by now. Odamine. Odamine, that's the strawberry. That's the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe word for strawberry. And we have an old story. The strawberry is the one that helps us move love into action. The one that helps us move love into action. So many, 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 many years ago, before people were even on the planet, everybody else was, but people have not been created yet. And the world is beautiful and everything is lush and everybody gets along because back then everybody spoke the same language. And then a time comes when all of a sudden people are starting to kind of look sideways at each other. Oh, maybe that, I think you're a little prettier than I am. I can't have that. Or I'm prettier than you, or I grow higher to the sun, or my fruit tastes better. And there's all of this bad vibe. That's literally what it says in Anishinaabe, bad vibe. I just made that up because I don't know what the word for bad vibe is in Anishinaabe. And creator, Kichi Manitou, our great mystery, our creator spirit, is bummed. Also, Anishinaabe word bummed. To see that unfolding unnecessarily. So he doesn't know what to do. They don't know what to do. They have a dream about this fruit, this berry that is shaped like a heart. And it has its seeds on the outside. So Kichi Manitou wakes up and creates the seed and starts planting it everywhere. And when strawberries start to sprout, everybody falls in love with the strawberry because it's so beautiful and it's shaped like a heart. And they start to mend their ways. They start to get along again. And the all because of the strawberry, all because of the heart of the strawberry, all because of how strawberry helps us move love into action. And I firmly believe, in the midst of all of this ranting and raving about how bad things were and how much we let still happen, I can ask how many people have heard of Métis, and most of the room raises their hands. That's love into action, at least as far as I'm concerned, for the things I care about. When I see the excitement in this town about someone like Robin Wall Kimmerer and the work that she's done with braiding sweetgrass, that is love into action. In the midst of all of my constant indignation about just about everything, I can see that there is love moving, there are things moving love into action. And that's where I want to end, is the consideration that we can change these things. They don't have to play out over and over the way they do. And there are little signs here and there that maybe we are moving things in that direction. And I hope we all leave this room considering what things that we can do to help move love into action. So miigwech, chi for your time and your attention, and I will happily take any questions at this point.
Hand-drawn or horse-drawn?
Horse followed by oxen. So the Métis also introduced cattle into the northern plains for the first time in 1810, 1812. So don't listen to the Texans when they claim that they brought cattle to this part of the country. We were already here. So sorry for anybody from Texas. We don't like Texas anyway, do we? Are there any Texans here? Let's talk about them a little bit. In the back.
I always wondered what the relationship is between the Diné in the north and the Dinés way south of us.
They're related. You know, what's the difference between the Diné in the north and the Diné in the south? Some migrated and some didn't. So even their language is very similar. I don't know a lot of details about that, but it is fascinating. Yes?
Was camas used as currency by the Métis?
Not to my knowledge. No, was camas used as currency? And I say not to my knowledge. Doesn't mean it wasn't, but anyone else? Yes?
So the Red River Valley and the ox carts, I imagine they also went south to like Minneapolis, St. Paul, area, Fort Snelling. So, and your map didn't kind of show that. So do you have family history that goes that far to the east into Minnesota?
Yeah, so Pembina, the town, which is like right in the very upper, like if you're facing north and you toss a rock, it's Canada. If you turn to the east and toss a rock, it's Minnesota. You toss a rock anywhere else, it's North Dakota. I mean, it's like right in that corner. In 1860, Pembina was the largest trading post, and there was a cart track that went from Pembina all the way to Minneapolis. And I date kind of the beginning of the demise of the Pembina Chippewa to what was called the Treaty of Old Crossing in 1863, which was a ford of the river where was halfway between these two places. And that's where they met in 1863 to have this treaty that ultimately led to the creation of some Ojibwe reservations, and Chief Little Shell II said he was never going to deal with the United States again after that particular interaction. And yeah, I mean, I was part of a small delegation of Little Shell people who went out there for a commemoration of the Treaty of Old Crossing a couple years ago. And it was powerful, to be out there where you can see the hillside where they had Gatling guns lined up, pointed down at the Indians. This is like 7 months after the largest mass execution in American history, when the United States hung 38 Dakota after the Dakota Uprising. There was still a scalp bounty on indigenous scalps at the time of the Treaty of Old Crossing. And those scalp hunters didn't make any distinction between Ojibwe and Dakota people. So yeah, we are deeply tied to that land. Yes. Yes. Sorry, I forgot your name.
Those images on the, the flag.
Doesn't it look like clip art? That's my favorite thing about our tribal image, is that it looks like clip art. So I know the guy who actually drew the buffalo. So the buffalo is our culture. And I've done presentations just talking about our relationship to the buffalo. And so they're there representing that. But he's facing west to represent our migration west. And then you have the eagle staff, which is every ceremony, every grand entry begins with the eagle staff, which is our power, And then the flags, you have the fleur-de-lis to represent our French connection. And then you have the shamrock to represent our Gaelic, Scotch, Irish connection. So it's all these little elements that comprise the Métis part of our Chippewa heritage. Yes?
When are you going to do a presentation on the buffalo then, on the bison?
Anybody got anything to do? I can hang around. There's a couple online, and I'm doing one on Lincoln, in Lincoln tomorrow night at the Lincoln High School. Yes.
You speak my language, Chris. I appreciate you reframing a lot of the information I know the way you did.
Thank you.
Talk about the image on your T-shirt and your thoughts on
Land back in the black flag symbol particularly. Yeah, land back, you probably hear a lot about it. What does it mean? It depends on who you ask. Land back isn't like, we're going to kick you guys back to where you came from. Land back means, let's relate to it the way we used to. We want to share this. What would the world have looked like if the first Europeans had said, we're going to live with these people, not take from them? What would the world look like? What would our country look like? That's what land back is about, is re-inviting. It's like the Yellowstone people wanting to re-indigenize Yellowstone National Park. It's bringing us back into the conversation. But that is huge, because just because you want an Indian on your board, or you want an Indian teacher, or you want an Indian book reviewer, doesn't mean you're going to find one. Doesn't mean there's a bunch of people just jumping for that opportunity, because we've never had the opportunity to really learn to be these things the way more privileged people have. So like everything else, it's an incredibly long game to decide we're going to provide opportunity, and I think we need to provide these opportunities to everybody who doesn't have one. Indians are just part of it. That's the we're all in this together. That's the we have to reconcile with everything that's brought us up to this point, admit that it happened, agree that it's never going to happen again, and then move forward in this more unified togetherness, family relationship. Does that answer your question? I mean, you see elements of land back, like the bison range, going back to the CSKT. There's some things out on the West Coast where tribes have gotten land back. In Minnesota, there was a big chunk of land recently that was given back to some Ojibwe people. Any other questions?
Lewistown, you mentioned it was founded by Métis families. Do you know now, are there still those families in the area? Like there's certainly Deschamps throughout the Missouri Valley, Frenchtown. And if there are, do they acknowledge Métis and?
Both. So there are people there who don't know, and there are people who are, who do. Every Labor Day, there's a big Métis celebration in Lewistown at the fairgrounds there. This past one, thank you for asking this question, because the first cemetery that was used by the Métis settlers was in one place. And then a guy came, a settler, claimed the land, and then ultimately decided, I don't want these graves on my land. So they exhumed them all and threw them in two mass graves in what had become the Calvary Catholic Cemetery up on the hill in Lewistown. And they didn't keep a record of who was there or even where the graves were. So one of our Little Shell people more than a decade ago, who was from Lewistown, kind of took it on herself to work towards finding the graves and then somehow creating a monument to them. And that just happened this year. So we had a big, the Friday before the Métis celebration, they unveiled the monument, and it's phenomenal. It's tall, and it's got the story of how the Métis came there, and it's got the names of all the people we know who are buried there, and space on the back to add names to them. And there were people from Canada who came to speak because they're tied there, and I got to speak, and my great-great-grandparents, Mose and Susie LaTray, are about where Celia is from where that monument is. And it was such an overwhelmingly powerful ceremony beyond anything that I could have imagined. To know that, 125 years later, finally, we're saying this is the spot and we're going to honor these people. And it was just spectacular. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about that. Who else? Yes.
Do you want to talk about how poetry is specifically suited to move love into action?
I've never studied poetry for a moment in my life. So my view of poetry tends to be different from, I think, people who have. My feeling is that, this moment is poetry. This is a poem. We, in all the billions and billions of people in the world and what they're doing and what they could be doing, we have all chosen to do this together. And I think that is a form of moving love into action. So in Anishinaabe, and this is what I teach when I go up on the reservation and teach kids. In Anishinaabe, we have our 7 grandfather teachings, which is like our blueprint for how to live your life. And if you live according to those traditions, if you live the Anishinaabe life, then every footstep becomes a prayer. Because it's a spiritual existence if you're living an Anishinaabe life. And I feel that way about poetry. If you're paying attention to the world around you and you're paying attention to the moments of your life, that is poetry, and you're living a poetic life. So if you choose to make that effort, then every step becomes a poem. And it doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter what's on the page. That's what I tell the kids, because a lot of them are functionally illiterate anyway that I work with. I tell them, I don't care what you write. I just care about how you are living in the world and how you're thinking about what your footsteps do to the world and how your life can impact everyone around you. To me, that is poetry. So every freaking word out of my mouth for the next 2 years is going to be an effort of poetry. Then I'll probably just go back to watching football and eating cheeseburgers, but we'll see. Maybe it'll change. But no, I'm being facetious. It's very important to me, that particular viewpoint. I tell people that poetry for too long has had a bag thrown over its head and dragged off to the ivory tower. And me and my people are going to climb up the walls and drag them back out again.
I wonder if you've had any more thoughts about inclusiveness in the community, especially as we talk about homelessness and those unhoused. I saw a piece of graffiti on the back of the Peace Center in a garbage dump that says, "No one gets seconds until everyone is housed."
Yeah.
And I didn't know if you had any thoughts about how to begin that process of housing our neighbors, because it's a huge issue in this community and in the country.
We have to show up when it's inconvenient to show up. So all too often we act in a matter of what is convenient and what isn't. I mean, that's the distraction of our lifetime, is convenience. The convenience of, name it, everything that we do so that we don't have to leave our house and interact with the people around us. And we have to somehow get over that. I have to get over that. I start looking at my watch at 8:30. It's like, well, I better be unconscious in 45 minutes or I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. And it is. We just have to be willing to show up and face some discomfort when interacting with people that we've never interacted with before. I wish I had more answers, but I really don't. You know, I just think we need to show up. Anyone else? Yes.
The Métis have a relationship with the French Canadian Voyageurs?
The Voyageurs were there in the grasp of the native woman at the founding of the Métis people. The Voyageurs are deeply tied to that. That's how we became Catholics long before we ever encountered missionaries. Because the Voyageurs would leave Montreal and they would pray to St. Anne at the St. Anne's Cathedral there because she was the patron saint of good weather. And they would pray to her to hope for good weather as they went down the rivers and up the rivers, measured by pipes. They measured the distance by pipes, how many pipes you could smoke between rest stops. So you'll see in some of those pictures all the pipes sticking out of everybody's face. And so they arrive, and they're the first ones who initiate these trading relationships and these marriages. And they're Catholic. So the initial Catholic indigenous people think of indigenous people converting to Christianity, and it really wasn't in the early days. It's like, it's a hard life, and we're going to take power wherever we can find it, and if this Jesus dude can do something for us, I'm all in. And so it was this mix. There's this Canadian scholar who calls it lived Catholicism because it was very tied to the land the way indigenous was. It was a mixture of all of our stories with our Manitous and our spirits of the directions and the waters mixed with the most basic level of Christianity. And that went on for a long time. And it wasn't until the missionaries showed up that it all went to hell. So yeah, the Voyageurs are, I mean, they're the superheroes of the North, you know? There was somebody over here, yes?
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to you said that the Little Shell became a recognized tribe in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess to the current process of having that happen, and if there was a lot of resistance or if it was private. I don't know.
Attention library patrons, the library will be closed.
Okay. Does that include us? Okay. So most tribes, so federal recognition was the result of treaties. So most tribes were recognized by the government as a result of treaties. Well, after the Civil War in 1871, the United States decided we're not going to recognize tribes as sovereign people anymore. We're going to deal with the ones we have, and we're going to initiate a long game to get rid of them too. But we're not going to recognize anybody. And that, you know, we're pretty good at surviving. So over the next 100 years, Indians didn't go away. So in 1978, the United States recognized that they needed to have a path to let tribes who had not participated in the treaty process have a means for them to get federal recognition as well. So that 1978 is when the Little Shell become the Little Shell. Up to that point, there were just kind of little factions around the state who were all vying to get some kind of recognition or a reservation or whatever for the landless Indians. So in 1978, when all of a sudden there's a path for unrecognized people to become recognized, we unite together under the name Little Shell and begin the long hassle of proving who we've known we are all along. 80,000 pages of documentation. We got recognized by the state in 2000. We were supposed to get recognized in 2009, and then that fell apart. And then in 2018, we were one vote away. So the Senate has a process called unanimous consent, where at the end of a session, they will have all these bills that need to be dealt with, but there's not time to debate them on the floor. So senators will, you know, if you do this, I'll do this, to get these things passed. And they just go down the line, boom, 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 and they vote for them. And it has to be unanimous for it to pass outside of committee like this. And unanimous in the House. There's one holdout in the Senate. Mike Lee from Utah said no. Of everybody, he said no. And it wasn't just our bill that he was just doing a power thing and was basically saying no to everything. So he wasn't a very popular guy, but he was really unpopular in my house. Because it's inevitable at that point that we're going to get federally recognized. It's inevitable because, you know, Tester, from his first when he was first elected, the first bill he introduced was the little shell recognition. And every Congress after that, he reintroduced that over and over and over again. It was inevitable. And what sucks about what Mike Lee did is there are people who devoted their lives to our federal recognition who died between 2018 and 2019. Nicholas Vrooman, who was my mentor, and we would not be recognized without him, died between 2018 and 2019. And for that little power trip, talk about not showing up, right? Yeah, that's how it happened. Yes.
Piggybacking on that, follow up by how much did it cost the tribe and how many dozens, if not hundreds of tribes still trying to gain federal recognition today that were terminated back in the 50s?
Yeah, so there's still a couple hundred tribes out there that haven't been federally recognized. But then there are also people for nefarious reasons who will create tribes and try and get recognized. For example, if you're living next to a populated area and you think you can build a casino and make a lot of money, you might come up with a fake tribe, try and pull that off. So there is, as in everything else, bullshit in the system that makes it a lot more difficult for other people. But for us, you know, we were literally funding our tribal council was all volunteer. When Gerald Gray would fly to Washington, D.C. to talk to Steve Daines and people like that, he was doing it on his own dime. Or we would raise money with bake sales and raffles. Literally, that's how we funded our operations, and donations. And what was happened for us is we're still trying to figure out with the BIA and IHS how much money we will get from the feds to operate our government. But what happened to us is that COVID happened, and we got $25 million in the bank when the CARES Act passed. And we were able to do things, projects that would have taken decades to get off the ground in a year. So for us, as terrible as COVID was, there was a silver lining in that it enabled us to do things for our people that we could not have done otherwise anytime soon. It's almost, I'm going to turn into a pumpkin. Thank you. Thank you for the great questions.
Before everyone leaves, if you would like to share in more poetry with Chris, in November 10th to be exact, we'll actually have him here with his Montana Poet Laureate hat on, and in his, I think it's your inaugural Montana Poet Laureate reading here at the library. So it's Friday, November 10th, and he'll be in conversation with another Montana poet, Corey Williamson. It should be really a lovely evening, so look for that in coming up. Thank you, everyone.